Part 18. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Zi. Chapter 171. The young prince is drunk again. Do you want to? It's broad daylight, aren't you ashamed? The chirping girls chattered. Su Buling was carried into the side hall with his legs spread out and put on the bed. Several palace maids watched him. Get out. What are you looking at? Chiao Yi looked serious and scolded the little palace maids, then pretended to cover the quilt. After the palace maids ran out in anger, Chiao Yi pursed her lips, and when she untied Su Buling's robe, she secretly pressed the chest of the snow-white collar, and then showed a guilty expression. Seeing that Su Buling didn't wake up, Chiao Yi plucked up her courage again and raised her hand to touch Su Buling's face. But this time, she was not so lucky. Su Buling raised his hand and grabbed the little hand that was touching him randomly. He opened his eyes and looked at the little beauty in palace clothes in front of him drunkenly. Ah dash! Chiao Yi was so frightened that her face turned pale. She tried to pull her hand out slowly and hurriedly, but failed. She could only nervously say, "I am helping the young prince cover the quilt." Su Buling stared at Chiao Yi like a drunkard for a while, until she felt numb all over. Then he sat up, let go of his hand and rubbed his forehead. "Find me some wine, and pens and ink, bring more." Chiao Yi blinked and hesitated, still drinking. Su Buling waved his hand, "Go quickly." Chiao Yi couldn't disobey Su Buling's intention, so she took the pen holder and a jar of wine from the side room and stood there waiting for orders. Su Buling stood up staggeringly, took the jar of wine and walked to the side hall, and Chiao Yi had to follow behind. The Changle Palace was sparsely populated, and there were not many people in the Queen Mother's bedroom. Although the side hall prepared for the prince's maids was cleaned, there was nothing to furnish. Chiao Yi and several other maids followed Su Buling carefully, fearing that he would do something crazy when drunk. It didn't matter if he had sex after drinking, he would just close his eyes and it would pass. What if he did something ridiculous later? What should he do? What the maids didn't expect was that the young prince walked to the wall drunk, stood there for a moment, and then splashed ink directly on the snow-white wall. Wow! The ink flew and instantly dyed the whole wall black, and strands of ink slid down the wall and fell on the pure ground. Ah! The maids panicked immediately, but they didn't dare to stop him. They could only watch the young prince destroy the house carefully. What they didn't expect was that after the young prince, who seemed to be spotless, splashed the ink, he took a sip of wine and sprayed it on the wall, then took a big brush from the pen holder, and smeared it on it as if he thought the white wall was not evenly damaged. He splashed it wantonly, without any logic. The snow-white robe was also stained with ink spots, but he didn't care at all. Several maids stared with wide eyes. They originally thought that the young prince was drunk, but after watching for a while, they gradually felt something was wrong. A petal shape gradually appeared in the corner of the wall splashed with ink. The maids' eyes changed from anxiety to confusion, and then confusion to astonishment. They stared blankly at the tall back, venting on the wall like a game of human life. Occasionally, he took a sip, and the cool wine slid from the corner of his thin lips and sprinkled on the white robe with auspicious clouds. With his handsome and unparalleled face, he was unrestrained and handsome. Swish, swish, swish. He changed several large and small brushes, and occasionally used his white palms to directly paint on the wall. Soon, the elegant young man in white clothes was stained with the fragrance of ink, but he didn't care at all. As the scroll gradually took shape, several young maids opened their mouths wide, and Chiao Yi leaned against the wall and stared at it in a daze, unable to even stand steadily. It was unknown how long it took before a young maid came to her senses. She wanted to speak loudly, but was afraid of disturbing the young master in the palace, so she whispered anxiously, "Sister Chiao Yi, hurry up, go and call the Queen Mother, to see the gods." "Yes, yes, yes." Xiao Yi was reluctant to look away, and after struggling for a long time, she gritted her teeth and rushed to the bedroom. A little earlier, it was about the time when Su Buling was just carried away. In the corridor of Changle Palace, a group of people walked slowly towards the Queen Mother's bedroom, and the maids led the way nervously in front. Xiaoting followed slowly behind, with a frustrated expression on his face, and muttered in a sad voice. "Sister-in-law, I was wrong, isn't it okay?" "You are not wrong, what's wrong with coming to the palace to visit the Queen Mother?" Mrs. Lu put her hands on her waist and glanced at Xiaoting coldly, as if she would stew Xiaoting if he dared to run. Mrs. Lu naturally knew that Su Buling would not enter the palace today. After being hinted by the maid, she felt empty and panicked when she woke up. After enduring for an hour or so, she could no longer sit still. It's not that she is worried about Su Buling, but she is worried about the Queen Mother. The Queen Mother doesn't care about Xiaoting now, and she must think Ling is more obedient. Thinking of this, Mrs. Lu was naturally panicked, and comforted herself in her heart. Ling said last time that it was just a show for socializing, and the Queen Mother must be unreasonable and will not let Ling go. As an elder, I naturally have to save Ling. With such a strange idea, Mrs. Lu ran over in a carriage, and brought Xiaoting with her, intending to restore the relationship between Xiaoting and the Queen Mother, so as to prevent the Queen Mother from taking a fancy to her baby. Xiaoting is the Queen Mother's nephew, and he never needs to be notified when entering Changle Palace. Naturally, the palace maids can't let Mrs. Lu wait for the notification, so they honestly took the two to the bedroom. Xiaoting walked with his face ashen and his neck shrunk. Seeing the big cauldron in the garden tremble again, he smiled awkwardly. "Sister-in-law, why don't we go back? Auntie is crazy. She must have stayed in the palace for too long. Don't mess with her." Bah! Mrs. Lu was angry when she heard this and glared at Xiaoting. "It's a pity that the Queen Mother is so good to you. You know that the Queen Mother is in a bad mood recently, but you don't know to come to accompany the Queen Mother." Xiaoting wanted to cry but had no tears. "Sister-in-law, I'm almost stewed." "You deserve it." Mrs. Lu snorted lightly and walked quickly to the front of the bedroom. She found that the door of the main hall was closed, and her brows frowned. In broad daylight, why close the door? Mrs. Lu muttered, and without waiting for the palace maid to report, she walked to the door and knocked. "Queen Mother." Ding-ling clang. In the main hall with the door closed, it seemed that something fell to the ground, and there was a flustered sound. Madame Lu immediately became suspicious, pursed her lips, raised her hand and pushed open the door of the main hall. In the beautifully decorated main hall, there were still some leftover wine and dishes on the table. The Queen Mother stood alone beside the soft couch, put her hands behind her back and made a dignified and polite expression, and nodded slightly. "Hongluan, why are you here?" The voice was very steady, and there was nothing wrong with it. Unfortunately, women's eyes are not so easy to fool. Madame Lu just breathed a sigh of relief, and then she found that the Queen Mother's expression was a little wrong, very flustered, and her hands behind her back seemed to be hiding something. "Queen Mother." "Aunt." The two entered the main hall. Xiaoting lowered his head and looked like he had done something wrong. Madame Lu frowned, looked up and down at the Queen Mother, and finally locked her eyes on the Queen Mother's beautiful lips. The Queen Mother was still calm, but when she saw Madame Lu looking at her lips, she panicked. The rouge box can be hidden behind her, but the lips can't be hidden. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 172. Seeing Mrs. Lu walking into the main hall with a suspicious expression on her face, the Queen Mother secretly thought something was wrong. If the jealous king of the capital knew that her baby was playing clever tricks, and then came to her to show her courtesy, Su Buling would have to be killed. The Queen Mother's thoughts changed rapidly, so she could only act calmly, sat down on the carved soft couch, and tilted her head to indicate the seat next to her. "Everyone, take a seat, Tinger is here too." Mrs. Lu's eyes were full of suspicion, and she walked to the soft couch and sat down. She looked at the Queen Mother's lips intentionally or unintentionally, as if she wanted to read the brand. Xiao Ting walked to the side cautiously. After struggling for a long time, he still showed his usual shameless smile. After taking a look at the Queen Mother, he said an exaggerated wow dash and exclaimed, "Oh my God! Auntie, why are you so beautiful today? You look like a fairy. Especially this lipstick, it matches so well. Who chose it for you? Chiao Yi can only buy expensive ones, but she doesn't have this ability." As soon as the words came out, the main hall became a little colder. The Queen Mother's expression changed, she patted the armrest and said angrily, "Come here, take him out for me to stew." Xiao Ting's face froze, his eyes filled with disbelief. "Why?" Several little maids hurriedly ran in and dragged Mr. Xiao out. "Hey, aunt, I praised you, don't, Tinger is wrong, you are not good looking at all, don't. The atmosphere in the main courtyard was strange. Mrs. Lu frowned, suppressing 100 emotions in her heart, put her hands on her knees, tilted her head and made a slight cut sound. It's rare for the Queen Mother to dress up so grandly. The Queen Mother chuckled twice and leaned on the soft couch as usual. Etiquette begins with formal attire. After Bulletin Ling finally entered the palace, it naturally had to be more grand. I usually don't leave the palace. This camellia resin was recommended by Aju. I thought it was okay, so I asked Bulletin Ling to help bring it. Mrs. Lu was dubious. "Really? I just brought it here and now it's used." "Yes, I just stopped being drunk and sent you to rest. I had nothing to do, so I painted it myself. What do you think?" Mrs. Lu looked at her carefully, and there was a hint of indifference between her brows. "Generally, red orchid nectar is more suitable." The words were sour, but the meaning was already obvious. He. The Queen Mother nodded with satisfaction and said with a chuckle, "I think it's normal, so I made the trip in vain." Mrs. Lu took a breath, put aside the quarrel for the time being, and turned to look at the table. As a result, when she looked at it, she saw a large snack box placed there. The box looked very familiar. The Queen Mother secretly thought something was wrong and explained calmly, "I like to eat these, so I asked Bulletin Ling to help me bring some." Mrs. Lu was a little confused, but she didn't think about what Su Buling was trying to say to her. She just snorted lightly. "You don't want to see anyone outside. Your child is the prince of the feudal lord. He has a body of a lot of money, but he has become your errand boy." In order not to get Su Bulletin Ling into trouble, the Queen Mother no longer argued with Mrs. Lu as she did in the past, but just smiled bitterly. While he was talking, there were footsteps outside the door. Chiao Yi hurriedly poked her head out of the palace door and chirped, Queen Mother, go and see, the young prince, he. Chiao Yi saw Mrs. Lu sitting in the room and quickly acted calmly and politely, but it was a pity that she was too late. Mrs. Lu thought something had happened to Su Bulletin Ling, so she stood up suddenly with a somewhat anxious look on her face. "What's wrong with your child?" The Queen Mother was also stunned for a moment and got up from the soft couch. Chiao Yi tried to calm down her emotions and said softly, "The young prince, he is drunk." "Oh, Queen Mother, Mrs. Lu, you'd better go and see for yourself, it's hard to say, maid." "Drunk?" Mrs. Lu frowned and thought about it, then panicked in her heart. Your child wouldn't have sex while drunk, and do that kind of thing to a palace maid, right? Due to her character and status, the Queen Mother is naturally a bit calmer. She felt that Jiao Yi's reaction was not right, so she quickly walked out of the main hall. "Go and take a look first." Mrs. Lu was anxious. She followed the Queen Mother out of the main hall, ignoring Xiaoting who was being tied to a shelf. She turned into the veranda and came to the side hall. The scene they saw made the two of them stunned for a moment. I saw that the maids of Changal Palace who usually had nothing to do were gathered in the garden of the side hall at this time. They blocked the windows and doors tightly, and they were silent as if they were holding their breath. If they had not walked up to them, they would not have thought that there are so many people gathered here. Mrs. Lu was a little confused. It didn't look like she was visiting the palace ladies in public. If it were, she would have scared these palace ladies away long ago. What was she doing? Seeing that the palace maid was so unruly, the Queen Mother frowned slightly and gave a slight cough sound. Ah, Queen Mother. The palace maids surrounding the room were startled, and they quickly backed away with their necks shrunk, leaving the way to the door. At this time, I finally heard the voice coming from the room. The peonies in front of the court have no character, and the hibiscus on the pond is pure and innocent. Peonies are the only true national beauty, and they move the capital when they bloom. It's drunk, but it's quite magnetic, and it actually has a pleasant taste. The Queen Mother and Mrs. Lu were stunned at the same time. They had no idea that Su Buling was drunk and actually composed a poem here. Both of them knew that Su Buling could write poetry, but they were a little bit curious as to why he came here to read poetry and write about peonies. Could it be that he became a poet after drinking? Only peonies are the true national color, and they move the capital when they bloom. The Queen Mother's eyes were wide open. This poem was clearly a metaphor for a person, praising her beauty, and it seemed to be written for her. After all, after the Queen passed away, she seemed to be the only one left in Chang'an who could be called a national beauty. Maybe Buletin was. The Queen Mother narrowed her eyes slightly, her eyes were complex and intriguing. On the other side, Madame Lu was also full of emotion. Su Buletin had said that she was like a peony flower. This poem was obviously written for her. But why did Ling run to the Queen Mother's palace to write a poem for her? Could it be that he was drunk and wrote a poem? Thinking of this, Madame Lu pursed her lips and ran quickly into the side hall, but she didn't expect that the scene she saw would shock her on the spot. The gorgeous palace, the white wall was right in front of her. The young man in white, covered in ink, held up a wine jar and drank it. A few brushes were thrown on the ground, rolling out a trail of ink. In front of the young man in white, there was a huge peony with splashed ink. It was over 10 feet tall, and in full bloom. Between black and white, it was a stunning beauty. And the young man in white was like being in the flowers, with strands of wine dripping from the corners of his lips. After drinking the strong liquor, the young man in white turned his head, revealing his familiar peach blossom eyes, which were always charming no matter how many times he looked at them. Their eyes met. Ling his. Su Buling, who had just been so handsome and unrestrained, suddenly changed his expression and stood still. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 173. Queen Mother. There was the sound of tiny footsteps outside the side hall. Su Buling, who had been waiting for a long time, stood in front of the snow-white wall decorated with ink stains, took up his pen and wrote in the lower right corner of the splash ink peony painting. Only peonies are the true national color. Ever since he made a promise to Mrs. Lu before the new year, he would stay at home and study this when he didn't go out for more than a month. I had some painting skills in my previous life, and I wanted to draw a sketch for Mrs. Lu, but unfortunately I had almost forgotten it, so I could only draw a simpler peony flower. So far, the effect is good. Tread. Light footsteps sounded from outside the door at the back. Su Buling pretended to be drunk and uninhibited, dropped the pen on the ground, raised his head and picked up the wine jar and took a big sip, then turned around and showed a bright smile, preparing to leave an unforgettable impression on the Queen Mother. Only, Your Majesty. Mrs. Lu, who was wearing a long blue dress, stared at her, eyes full of tenderness, and stood at the door infatuatedly. Her hands folded on her waist held the skirt tightly, her mouth was slightly open, and her cheeks were full of shock and disbelief. Su's temperament didn't make his heart stop. He was also startled and felt a chill running down his spine, from head to toe. Why did Aunt Lu come here to kill her? My life is at an end. Mrs. Lu's eyelashes trembled slightly, her eyes swept over the peonies splashed with ink on the wall, and then looked at Su Buling, who was covered in ink. She pursed her lips for a long time, unable to say a word. Su Buling was not frightened yet. As his mind changed rapidly, the wine jar in his hand fell to the ground and shattered into pieces. Then he staggered 2 steps forward. Aunt Lu, he. Then he became unstable and fell forward. Ah! Mrs. Lu finally woke up and hurriedly stepped forward to hug Su Buling. She staggered under the weight of her heavy body, but because of her experience last time, she was able to hold Su Buling on. Mrs. Lu held Su Buling's arm and patted his chest twice angrily. Why did you drink so much? It's really. The maids also ran in hurriedly, but they didn't know how to help. Su Buling's drunken breath blew on Mrs. Lu's cheek. Well, I drank too much. In front of the public, Mrs. Lu didn't feel anything at all. Just like an elder supporting a younger one, she softly lectured. Stand up straight, in public. It's a pity that these words obviously can't wake up the person who is pretending to be drunk. Su Buling looked confused and just leaned against Mrs. Lu with half-closed eyes like a puddle of mud, pretending to be dead. The Queen Mother also walked into the hall at this time. She looked up and saw the huge splash ink peonies on the wall, and her eyes clearly flashed with surprise. Even Mrs. Lu didn't pay attention. She walked quickly to the wall and looked at it carefully with her mouth open. Her eyes were even more shocking than Mrs. Lu's. Splash ink paintings are not uncommon in the market. In terms of quality, Su Buling's painting is definitely not as accomplished as the painting Sage Su Danking, but which of the following sentences, only peonies are the true national color, when the flowers bloom, move the capital, it can be said to be the finishing touch. When the two are combined, the artistic conception is elevated to countless levels. The Queen Mother observed it for a long time, but she couldn't find any words to comment on it. This. Mrs. Lu's heart was focused on Su Buling, and then she looked at the peonies on the wall again. She pursed her lips and looked at them for a moment, then said softly. Ling did you draw this? Su Buling was about to cry but had no tears. He said a faint hum and laughed again. Mrs. Lu's eyes clearly showed a bit of pride. She supported Su Buling and looked up. The more she looked at it, the more she liked it. She was just a little bit curious as to why Su Buling painted such a painting in the Queen Mother's palace. Just as he was about to ask, the dumbfounded Queen Mother next to her spoke first. No, is this a painting for me? The Queen Mother curled her hands on her chest and carefully looked at the splash ink peonies on the wall from top to bottom, as if there was a flash of light in her eyes. Mrs. Lu's face froze, and the emotion she just felt was gone. With a bit of suspicion, she turned her eyes to Su Buling again. Is it possible? Su Buling chuckled and said nothing. Mrs. Lu took a breath. This was obviously a painting for her. Ling said last time that she would paint a painting for her. Thinking of this, Mrs. Lu looked at the Queen Mother coldly. Your Majesty, you think too much. Your child painted this for me. The voice was neither salty nor bland, with a hint of sarcasm. The Queen Mother's agitated mood froze slightly, and she frowned slightly. She really likes this painting. She has been interested in these things since she was a child. She is somewhat polite out of courtesy and comes to the door to snatch her things. Do you think she is really easy to bully? The Queen Mother looked away from the painting, turned her head to look at Mrs. Lu, snorted lightly, raised her finger and pointed at the wall. Really? Then take the painting back. Are you seeing's eyes were a bit mocking and contemptuous, as if she was looking at a fool. Mrs. Lu's eyebrows frowned, and her expression suddenly darkened. The painting is on the wall, how can she take it back? In the empty hall, there was a sudden chill, as if it was a cold winter day again. The palace maid outside remained silent, cautiously lowered her head, moved her steps, and hid aside. Mrs. Lu's chest was heaving, and the annoyance was obvious in her eyes. Thinking of the rouge box and snack box just now, she always felt that something was wrong. Mrs. Lu was silent for a moment, then suddenly came back to her senses. Her expression was full of disbelief, and she raised her hand and patted Su Buling's clothes twice. Ling-er? Ling-er? Did you paint this painting for me? Su Buling felt like he had fallen into an ice cellar and felt that he could not die. He obviously did not dare to answer this question. Speaking of painting it for Mrs. Lu, today's efforts would be in vain, let alone make the Queen Mother roll her eyes. It would be polite for the Queen Mother not to let him rebuild the side hall. As for the painting for the Queen Mother. Seeing Mrs. Lu's aggrieved and sad eyes, Su Buling's bones were really weak. Even though his life was in danger due to the dragon Lok Gu, he couldn't say such hurtful words. With Mrs. Lu's temperament, if she tears a hole in her heart, she may not be able to heal it in her lifetime. Su Buling didn't hesitate at all, he chuckled, closed his eyes and leaned on Mrs. Lu's shoulder. Keep playing dead. Mrs. Lu was angry and annoyed. Seeing the Queen Mother folding her arms and showing a playful smile, she could only raise her hand and wave it a few times. Ling-er, please speak clearly to save the Queen Mother from misunderstanding. Ling-er. Hee, I drank too much. You are talking. The Queen Mother stood nearby, knowing in her heart that this painting must be for her. Su Buring didn't dare to speak, so she pretended to be dumbfounded. Seeing Mrs. Lu chattering endlessly, the Queen Mother also lost her sarcastic thoughts and walked up to persuade. Hongluan, forget it, your son is drunk, you can send him back to rest. Mrs. Lu was obviously a little angry when she saw Su Buling drunkenly unconscious and ignoring her, but she couldn't lose her composure in front of the Queen Mother. She could only look at the wall reluctantly and help Su Buling out. The voice is cold. Your Majesty, your daughter was drunk and messing around today and stained the walls of the house. I will ask someone to come over and clean it up later. The meaning is obviously I can't get it, and you don't want it either. Unfortunately, this place is the territory of the Queen Mother, and Mrs. Lu is not allowed to make the decision. The Queen Mother crossed her arms and looked like she didn't mind. It doesn't matter, she's quite beautiful. I'm not a foolish woman who doesn't know how to write. How could I do anything like burning harps and boiling cranes? Although he has been very restrained, he still carries a knife with every sentence and kills his heart with every word. You. Being insinuatedly compared to a foolish woman who burns harps and cooks cranes, Mrs. Lu's face turned livid, but she had no reason to scold him back, so she had no choice but to support Su Buling and walk out of the door with heavy steps. The Queen Mother watched the two men staggering away, turned around and walked back to the portrait, raising her eyes to carefully look at the huge peonies on the wall. A red dress is extremely eye-catching in the cold palace, as if it embellishes the dark peonies with moving colors. Chiao Yi and several palace maids cautiously walked up to the palace and watched it with the Queen Mother. So beautiful. It's so big. The Queen Mother seemed not to hear the words around her, with a certain luster in her eyes. She raised her hand to touch her lips, feeling a little distracted. Chiao Yi took a few glances and felt that something was wrong with the Queen Mother today. It seemed that in just one morning, all the worries in the palace for the past 10 years had been wiped away, and she had returned to the little daughter she was when she was married. Qiao Yi hesitated for a moment and then reminded. Queen Mother, what should I do with this painting? The Queen Mother came back to her senses, turned her head to look in the direction Su Buling left, and shook her head. Keep it, don't let the palace know, and lock the door in the future. Oh. Thank you Mom for saying I look like a Sanlu boss and you will be rewarded. I fell asleep and forgot to update regularly. I'm really sorry. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 174. At noon, Yunu and two maids helped Su Buling, who was drunk, out of the Queen Mother's chamber. After discovering Xiaoting who was tied to a pillar in the garden, he started crying for his father and mother again. Sister-in-law, Brother Su, you should put me down before leaving. The water is about to boil and I'm only 18. Yunu and the maid held back their laughter, but did not dare to say anything. Mrs. Lu couldn't forget about Cai's affairs. She was so angry that she didn't care about Xiaoting's life and death. She snorted coldly without raising her head. Go cry to your aunt, you are such an adult, and you have the same virtues as your aunt. No, sister-in-law, my aunt is crazy. Please let me down. I will call you aunt from now on. Roll. Madame Lu ignored Xiaoting and walked out of Changle Palace quickly. The maid helped Su Buling get into the carriage. Mrs. Lu kicked everyone out. Once the carriage door was closed, she sat on the couch without saying a word. Yunu knew that Mrs. Lu was sulking, so she didn't dare to say anything. She said softly drive dash and started on the way back to Kuishao Street. The luxurious carriage is rickety, the carriage is very spacious, and all tea sets and soft couches are available. After Su Buling entered the carriage, he immediately lay down on the soft couch and started pretending to be drunk. He did not dare to wake up at this time. Mrs. Lu was sitting next to Su Buling's waist, her eyes full of suspicion and stuffiness, her breathing rising and falling, and stamping her feet from time to time. Just now in Changle Palace, Mrs. Lu noticed something was wrong when she saw the snack box and camellia resin. After a brief recollection, she remembered that last time Su Buling came over and said some random things, and when she answered, she told her everything she liked about the Queen Mother. This is simply. The Queen Mother is also an elder, and it is okay to care about her, but it is different to care about the Queen Mother in a pretense way. What is the difference between this and a heartless man using the madam's beloved jewelry to please whom he is? What did you think? Heartless. The more Mrs. Lu thought about it, the angrier she became. She raised her hand and patted Su Buling on the back. She pursed her lips and her eyes were watery, and she was about to cry. Su Buling lay on the couch and lived like a year. He snorted symbolically and still didn't wake up. Mrs. Lu sat sideways on the couch, looking at the ink stains on Su Buling's clothes, and she became even more angry. The robe was sewn by her own hands. That painting of peonies and that poem were obviously for her. But why was it painted in the Empress Dowager's palace? Maybe it was originally given to her. After drinking too much and being coaxed into being happy, it was passed on to the Empress Dowager. It's just too much of a lie. Mrs. Lu pursed her lips tightly, thinking wildly for a long time, and suddenly made herself cry. She raised her hand and shook Su Buling. Get up. Get up. Speak clearly. With a bit of crying. Su Buling had no other choice. If he pretended to be dead again, Mrs. Lu would be so angry that she would jump into the well. He had to open his eyes dizzily, push up his body with difficulty, and look up. What's wrong? Seeing that Su Buling had regained consciousness, Mrs. Lu restrained herself slightly and stared at Su Buling with tears in her eyes. Your Majesty, who did you paint that painting in the palace for? Su Buling sat on the couch and rubbed his forehead drunkenly, The painting, oh, it looks good, I have prepared a lot for Aunt Lu. After hearing this admission, Mrs. Lu's heart was in turmoil and she finally calmed down. I knew, the Queen Mother is so sentimental. After muttering angrily, she swayed and wanted to fall down. Su Buling asked, what are you doing with the paintings in Changle Palace? And what's going on today? Su Buling was so shaken that he couldn't speak clearly. Well, I drank too much, the Queen Mother is the elder. What elder? Mrs. Lu's eyes were full of displeasure, and she grabbed Su Buling's arm and shook it. What's the deal with the snacks and the rouge? You asked about these things in front of me last time. Okay, the wings are hard, let me. This aunt doesn't take it seriously anymore. She's trying to trick me. I. The more Mrs. Lu talked, the more aggrieved she became, and she wanted to wake Su Buling up and explain things clearly to her. Su Buletinling's scalp was numb. If he woke up, he would have to be tortured to death. Seeing Mrs. Lu's attitude of not giving up, he was tangled in his heart for a moment, and he could only feel. Mrs. Lu looked at Su Buling aggrievedly and shook for a moment. Not only did Su Buling not wake up, she even leaned over drunkenly and raised her hands as if to hug her. Mrs. Lu's eyes were full of astonishment, and she was stunned on the spot, a little confused. In this moment of confusion, Su Buletinling gave Mrs. Lu a bear hug, hugging her tightly, and patting her back gently with her hands as if teasing a child. Be good, don't cry, Aunt Lu is the most obedient. Mrs. Lu had goosebumps all over her body. Her confused thoughts just now were gone. She was so strangled that she couldn't breathe. She twisted her shoulders in shame and annoyance. Damn boy, what are you doing? Her voice was very low, afraid of the maid outside. Here. Su Buletinling, with Nephrite in his arms, fell back and lay down on the couch, hugging Mrs. Lu and rolling around like a drunken maniac. Be good, don't make trouble, don't make trouble. Ah dash. Mrs. Lu's face turned red and she was stunned for a moment. She never expected that Su Buling would be so arrogant and rude. No, your child is drunk. Mrs. Lu remembered what happened on New Year's Eve again, and her whole body trembled slightly. She suddenly panicked. She was afraid that the maid outside would hear it, so she didn't dare to struggle. Her eyes were full of shyness and she whispered. Your Majesty. I am your aunt. Shhh, don't mess around. Su Buling looked up and looked around dizzily, but he did not let go. Instead, he looked drunk and stern. Are you still making trouble? The breath full of alcohol sprayed on her cheeks. Mrs. Lu's mind was blank. She was afraid that Su Buling would forget himself and start to take off her clothes again after drinking. She had to suppress her messy emotions and act gentle and considerate, smiling and comforting. Don't make trouble, Ling, wake up, I'm your aunt. The word aunt was emphasized. Su Buling secretly breathed a sigh of relief, thought about it, raised his hand and pinched Mrs. Lu's red face. Mrs. Lu suddenly shrank her neck, closed her eyes tightly, and then was pressed down again, and the sound of hot breathing came to her ears. After suffering a loss last time, Mrs. Lu did not dare to move at this time, for fear of waking Su Buling again. Being pressed by the heavy man's body, an indescribable feeling surged in her heart. Mrs. Lu was neither ashamed nor angry. Her mind was in a mess. She could only purse her lips carefully and push Su Buling slightly. Unexpectedly, Su Buling reacted strongly. He raised his head again and looked at her with an unsatisfied look. Mrs. Lu was immediately frightened and hurriedly showed a gentle smile. I won't make a fuss, go to sleep. Humph. Su Buling was satisfied and used Mrs. Lu as a meat cushion again, lying on the couch and sleeping soundly. Dead boy. Mrs. Lu scolded in a voice as soft as a mosquito's hum, her face flushed, and she stared at Su Buling with gritted teeth, but she didn't know what to do. Fortunately, after the carriage reached Kuishao Street, Su Buling turned over. Mrs. Liu, who was almost suffocated by the pressure, finally escaped. She stood up in a hurry to tidy up her dress. Perhaps she was really angry, so she kicked Su Buling on the leg with her embroidered shoes. As a result, Su Buling suddenly turned over, looking like he was ready to go wild. Mrs. Liu was so scared that she screamed "Ah!" and hurried to the door of the carriage and knocked twice. "You knew, stop the car quickly," and then ran down the carriage in a hurry. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 175. At dusk, Zhu Manzi put on a small skirt, and the box of rouge was also sent by Su Buling. She was dressed beautifully and happily ran to the son's shop, waiting for someone to appear. Although she knew Su Buling would not come over today, Zhu Manzi still waited seriously. Firstly, because he had nothing to do after get off work, and secondly, because people always have to look forward to some surprises, just in case he comes. Because the weather has cleared up in spring, there are a few more customers in the wine shop. They are noisily talking about Su Danking's return, and are also asking shopkeeper Sun if he has any news about Su Danking's residence. Shopkeeper Sun was naturally very talkative, with an appetizing look of "you guess." Zhu Manzi listened for a moment, touched his cheek, and thought of Ning Qingyi again, and couldn't help but secretly sighed. If Xiao Ning was here, he would be the first one to be drawn in. It's a pity, he left a few days ago. Sky. After staying in the Bluestone Alley for a while, Su Buling naturally didn't come over. Zhu Manzi wandered around the street twice with nothing to do, and unknowingly came to the vicinity of an uninhabited courtyard. I was about to turn around and leave, but suddenly I smelled a faint smell of medicine. Huh? Zhu Manzi frowned. He had been here many times before and could smell the same medicine as Ning Qingyi's medicine. He thought Ning Qingyi had turned back halfway and came back. His eyes suddenly lit up and he hurried to the door of the hospital. The door to the courtyard is open. In the clean courtyard, a small stove is placed under the eaves. The figure in black robes has his back to the courtyard door and is brewing medicine. A sword is leaning on the wall, and a raincoat and a bamboo hat are hanging on the wall. Viewed from behind, the Taoist priest's figure looked familiar. Because he was squatting, his hips were wider than his shoulders. His long hair was tied up with a wooden hairpin on his head. He looked like a Taoist nun. As soon as Zhu Manzi glanced at it, he knew he had recognized the wrong person. He wanted to walk away quickly, but the female Taoist priest in the yard turned her head, revealing a slightly pale face, double eyebrows, slender nose, and a high bridge. Her eyes are as spirited as autumn water and not stained by the slightest trace of dust, and the ordinary Taoist robe on her body also adds a bit of fairy-like Taoism. A very good-looking Taoist nun. Zhu Manzi did not have a photographic memory, but he was deeply impressed by this female Taoist priest whom he had seen once outside the city. Naturally, he recognized her. Thinking of Su Buling running out to chase the Koi raincoat assassin last night, he immediately understood that the people in the yard had never "Where did it come from?" Under the eaves of the courtyard, Ningyu he naturally recognized the wolf guard who had looked at her outside the city. She had just gone to trouble Zhangxiang, and when she met the disguised wolf guard here, she was naturally alert. She thought he was coming in disguise to confirm the truth, so she immediately stood up and touched the sword beside her. When the female wolf guard at the door saw her turning back, she hurriedly lowered her head and wanted to leave. Ning Yuhi's eyes narrowed slightly, and the long sword in his hand was already unsheathed. There was only a soft sound of sizzling, and the scabbard flew out of the courtyard, plugged directly into the alley wall. "Oh, my dear, please spare your life, Taoist master, please spare my life." A scabbard suddenly appeared in front of Zhu Manzi's eyes. He was so frightened that he trembled and hurriedly held his head and begged for mercy. "I am Mr. Su's disciple, Su Buling. When Ning Yuhi heard this, he became less cautious. He held his long sword upside down and walked slowly to the door of the courtyard. He lowered his head and took a look. Did Mr. Su send the girl here? Zhu Manzi nodded quickly. Yes, please don't take action, otherwise Mr. Su will be angry. Ning Yuhi nodded slightly, pulled out the scabbard, took back the long sword, and performed a ritual. I've offended you, girl. Get up and go into the house to talk. Zhu Manzi secretly breathed a sigh of relief, stood up and followed Ning Yuhi into the courtyard. His eyes were a little strange, and he muttered to himself, why did he pick up another foxy girl? She is still a Taoist nun. She looks older than Mr. Su, what kind of taste is it? Squeak. After the courtyard door was closed, Ning Yuhi showed a slight smile, lowered his head and looked at the little girl, a little embarrassed. Master Su asked you to come over, but something happened. Zhu Manzi pursed his lips and smiled, and his thoughts changed quickly. Well, it's nothing, just let me come and take a look. By the way, my name is Zhu Manzi, we seem to have met once outside the city. Ning Yuhi nodded lightly. Ning Yuhi is a poor man. Ning Yuhi. Zhu Manzi was stunned for a moment, feeling that the name sounded familiar. After thinking about it for a moment, his eyes widened, full of surprise. The Taoist master is Gu Qiu. Xiaoning, no, Ning Qingyi's master. Ning Yuhi was slightly surprised when he heard his apprentice's name. Does the girl know Qingyi too? Yeah, Zhu Manzi nodded like he was pecking at rice, and quickly raised his hand to make a quaint salute. It turns out it's Senior Ning, whom I've admired for a long time. I'm Xiaoning's friend, and we have a good relationship. She also lived here before. This courtyard, what a coincidence. When Zhu Manzi said this, he suddenly felt strange in his heart that Mr. Su had saved Xiaoning, and now he had saved Daning. Could it be that he was thinking? Thinking of this, Zhu Manzi trembled and quickly gave up the messy thoughts. Mr. Su is a decent man, how could he do such a ridiculous thing as master and apprentice serving the same husband together? But Ning Yuhi is a famous beauty, and so is Xiaoning. With random thoughts, Zhu Manzi's eyes gradually became weird. Ning Yuhi was a monk, so he didn't expect this little girl to have such evil thoughts. He turned around and walked to the eaves to continue brewing the medicine. Girl, sit down. Zhu Manzi nodded, walked up to him a little cautiously, took out a small bench and sat down, and glanced at Ning Yuhi secretly. Although Ning Yuhi's words and demeanor were very gentle, she felt a bit repulsive to others. I can't tell where this feeling comes from, maybe it's because of my personality. Just like Xiaoning, she looks cold on the surface, but in fact she is very sultry. When he first arrived, Ning Yuhi didn't know Zhu Manzi, so he couldn't ignore the guests, so he found a topic. Where is the girl from? How come you came to Chang'an to become a wolf guard? When Zhu Manzi heard this, he sighed a little disappointedly. I grew up in the Fenhe area. My parents must be from Jianghu. They abandoned me and disappeared the year before last. I became a police officer just to find them. Oh, it's a pity. There is no news. Ning Yuhi nodded. What are your parents' names? Oh, I asked a lot of people, but they don't know my parents. They probably used pseudonyms when they were traveling around the world. Well, my father's name is Zulu, and my mother's name is Gihua. Anyway, as long as I can remember, my father he just called me mother and never said anything else to me. By the way, my father also used a sword and taught me when I was a child, but unfortunately I only learned one move. Zulu, Osman thus. Ning Yuhi frowned and thought about it. She had indeed never heard of this person. However, she had learned swords since she was a child and was born in a family of swordsmen. She had a deep understanding of swordsmanship, so she said. Girl, can you practice one or two? Zhu Manzi hesitated slightly. My father said that move is very powerful. A martial artist must hide his killing move and not look at people easily. If the Taoist master wants to see it, that's fine. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Zi. Chapter 176. Zhu Manzi stood up, ran to the wall and folded a small branch. After thinking about it for a while, with a flick of his wrist, the branch suddenly collapsed with a pop sound. Then he stepped forward and back, raising his sword. Straight towards the courtyard wall. Rustle. The tree branches made a sound like the sound of a sword breaking through the wind. This sword has a certain shape. It has obviously been practiced hard for a long time. It seems to be an understatement, but the strength is terrifying. The finger-thick branch was driven into the wall masonry for more than an inch until it could no longer bear it and the branch exploded from the center. Break into sections. Ning Qingyi's eyes lit up. She didn't expect this ordinary little girl to be capable of such powerful tricks. The sword moves lightly and drifts, and the blade is usually slender and easy to break. A normal swordsman would never use the sword to swerve and use such a strong thrust that may break the sword. The sword strip cannot withstand it and breaks before it penetrates. If you want to pierce a branch into the masonry, just how to use force is a big question, just like the golden dragon Hikao of Tongbei Quan or the fighting in all directions at night of Bagwadeo. It's useless to just learn the postures, but what's inside? The secret of exerting force and withdrawing force is the secret of all major schools. Ning Yuhi has been learning swords since he was a child. Even though he has rarely encountered opponents in martial arts, he still thinks that he can't stab with the sword just now. It's not that his martial arts skills and strength are not as good as Zhu Manzi's, but that he doesn't know how to do it. It is possible to learn this kind of killing move that is enough to support the appearance. The person who created this move must also be a swordsman master. Thinking of this, Ning Yuhi's expression became a little more serious and he thought about it carefully. Zhu Manzi finished stabbing with his sword, shook off his numb right hand, ran back to the eaves with some satisfaction, and said with a smile. Taoist priest, do you see anything? Ning Yuhi was silent for a while. This sword is not an orthodox sword move. It should have evolved from the Zhongping spear in the Liuhe spear. As the saying goes, a Zhongping spear is a king of spears. The middle point is the most difficult to guard against Zhongping spear. The spear is the killing move of the Liuhe spear. It is extremely difficult to defend against, and the ones who are good at both offense and defense are Xuechenzi, the old master of the Liuhe Gate of Jiangnan Road, and Chen Chong, the northern Xinjiang spearman. He's always walking around in the world, so he doesn't look like your father. Zhu Manzi was confused when he heard this. Where are the others? Ning Yuhi thought about it for a while, and suddenly thought of something. How old is the girl this year? 16, soon to be 17. 17 soon, named Zhu. Ning Yuhi frowned and recalled seriously for a moment. I was born in the Tang family of Yuzhu. When I was young, I heard that the old sword master Zhu Silk Mountain once had an incompetent concubine. He was extremely talented and was highly regarded by the old sword master. It was a pity that he was young and naughty, and instead of learning Zujiajian, he went around to become apprentices. The Zhu family is a famous swordsmanship family. The old sword master, with his own strength, overwhelmed all the swordsmen in the world and couldn't hold their heads up. Seeing that the bastard was not doing his job and running away to learn some heretical ways, he drove him out of the house in anger. In the end, there was no successor and I regretted it, but it was a pity that I couldn't find it. The bastard seems to be the sixth child. This matter has been laughed at by the Tang family for a long time, so I have a little impression. Zhu Manzi's eyes lit up, and he got a little closer. I've heard of the old sword master Zhu Silshan, and he seems to be very powerful. What happened next? Ning Yuhi shook his head and sighed. then the imperial court iron eagle hunted deer. The old sword master had a stubborn temper. He felt that the arena was the arena, and it was no longer an arena if the imperial court intervened. He refused to obey the imperial court's orders. The imperial court sent many experts surrounded the Zhou family, and the Tang family and the Kui family also participated. In the end, no one could withstand 3 moves under the old sword master's sword. In the end, no one knew what method was used to kill the old sword master. According to rumors in the world, the old swordsman died, his sword was not broken, and he was surrounded by powerful enemies, but no one dared to get within 10 steps. He was not found dead until he was shot by a bow and arrow. Therefore, people in the world said that the old swordsman was dead. The sword master died for a petty crime, not a crime of war. The same is true for the old head of the Liu family in the East China Sea. He guarded the house alone with 1 sword and was still unscathed even when he died of exhaustion. The 2 old-timers have been fighting for their whole lives, but they never thought that they would both die in the dark. It is a pity. Zhu Manzi pursed his lips, a little sad. I heard that all the men in the Zhu family died. Ning Yuhe frowned and thought for a moment. All the men of the Zhu family were indeed dead at that time, but the 6th child had been expelled for many years and there was no news, and he did not come back to take revenge afterwards, so no one remembers this person. So, judging from your swordsmanship just now, your father cannot be an unknown person, he may be the son who was expelled from the family by the old sword master. Zhu Manzi held his cheek and thought carefully for a while. It sounds possible, then my parents may have run away from home to seek revenge, but I have never heard of such news in the detective department. Ning Yuhe smiled softly. There were many masters who besieged the Zhu family back then, and people died every day in the world. It is normal that there is no news. But if it is really an orphan of the Zhu family, he will definitely go to the Tang family in Yuzhou to avenge blood. I am here after I'm done with my business in the capital. I can accompany you on a trip around the world. Zhu Manzi was stunned for a moment, then sat up straight and felt confused. Taoist master, we just met, how can this be so embarrassing? Besides, your surname is Tang, right? Ning Yuhe looked at the sword beside him and said in a gentle voice, although I am a monk, the mortal world can be broken, and blood feud cannot be let go. My mother died at the hands of the Tang family, and this revenge must be avenged. I will help you find your parents, and then how about you ask your father to teach me swordsmanship? Zhu Manzi thought for a while and nodded. That's okay, my father has listened to me, but my father may also be a farmer, I am not responsible for finding the wrong person. Ning Yuhe nodded slightly and agreed. Zhu Manzi chuckled, held his chin in his hand and carefully looked at the Taoist nun in front of him, hesitated for a moment, and asked curiously. I heard that the senior is the most beautiful woman. She is indeed very beautiful. It's time to dress up. Ning Yuhe shook her head and smiled. Her delicate face showed some helplessness. It's just a rumor spread by the gossipers in the world. In order to put together a set of 8 beauties, Su Danking offended many women. After finishing the painting, he retired to the mountains to avoid his enemies. It's hard to paint beauties in the world is just an excuse for himself to retire. I happen to be the last one. Zhu Manzi thought about it and hummed, red-faced skeletons, monks don't care about appearance, right? Ning Yuhe raised his eyes and glanced at the little girl opposite, chuckled and said, Taoist nuns are not nuns. They also have Taoist partners and can marry and have children. They will naturally care about their appearance. Otherwise, there wouldn't be so many ways to keep their youth, but for me, it's really a burden. I can't practice in peace. I'm still in trouble. It's better to be ordinary. Zhu Manzi pursed her lips and wanted to say a full girl doesn't know the hunger of a hungry girl, but it seemed a bit self-degrading to say so. After thinking about it, she gave up. Thank you for the reward from 123 sir. I am almost at the end of the volume. I will sort out the plot a bit and update 5 more chapters tomorrow. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Zi. Chapter 177. The breeze swept through the garden of the Prince Su's mansion. In just a few days, the bear garden was already full of greenery. In the early morning, after Su Buling finished his morning exercises in the yard, he returned to the study with his sword and sat behind the desk to continue thinking about rolling his eyes. It had been 5 days since he last entered the palace. Madame Lu suddenly entered the palace and caught him in the act. Su Buling thought that he would make a fuss for half a month, but it turned out that he was silent after being hugged in the carriage last time. That day, he was sent back to the palace and hurried back to the Xiao family. Until today, he has not troubled him. Su Buling was afraid that Madame Lu would lock him in the house and sulk, so he went to Jinghua Garden to visit Madame Lu. As a result, Madame Lu was sitting at home embroidering, as if nothing had happened. When asked if he drank too much when he entered the palace that day, Madame Lu just said that he fell asleep in the car and did not do anything. She told him to drink less in the future. It seems that this matter should be covered up. However, because of this incident, Su Buling couldn't go to the palace again, so he stayed at home these days. Su Buling still couldn't figure out what the Queen Mother was thinking at the moment, but it was definitely not a natural thing yet. At most she looked at him differently. After waiting at home for a few days, the Queen Mother seemed to have forgotten about the belly band and didn't invite him to the palace. To cultivate feelings, you must first establish contact. Waiting at home is definitely not enough. There is no communication tool and you can't send pigeons, so you still have to find a way to enter the palace. The early spring swallows chirped outside the window. When Su Buling was frowning and thinking, Lao Xiao walked into the courtyard with a cane and said with a smile, "Little prince, Miss Song came over and said she wanted to see you. Should I let her in?" Su Buling raised his eyebrows slightly. He hadn't been to the Imperial College for a month or so, and he hadn't had the chance to see Song Yafu after Yingchun Tower. Recently, he was busy with detoxification, but he ignored his girlfriend. He tilted his head to look at the pen holder on the desk. A small doll was leaning against the pen holder, with a small note of Su Buling attached to it. It was squatting there pitifully, almost moldy. Su Buling pondered for a while, stood up and tidied his clothes in front of the bronze mirror, took a box of rouge from the cabinet, and left the palace alone. The spring sun sprinkled faintly on the stone lions outside the palace. The street was spotlessly clean. There were few pedestrians, only the occasional dignitaries drove by. Song Yafu stood alone beside the stone lion. She had changed into a light green spring skirt, with a jade hairpin on her head and 2 small and exquisite earrings hanging on both sides. Her fair face had a delicate and powdery luster in the spring sunshine. Occasionally, she tiptoed to the vermilion lacquered gate. Although the gate was open, the screen wall blocked her sight and she could not see anything. Ah! Song Yafu sighed faintly, folded her hands on her waist, and her eyes showed a bit of loneliness. The last time she came back from Yingchun Tower, Su Buling returned the hairpin to her and said, "The grudges between us have been resolved." She was very happy at first, thinking that she had finally gotten over the unreasonable little prince. But a few days later, she realized something was wrong. At first, Su Buling didn't come to the Imperial College for classes, and she thought he was busy, but it had been a month, and she hadn't seen him or heard any news from him. It seemed that he had forgotten her. Logically, the two of them didn't have much to do with each other. But Song Yafu always felt empty in her heart, and couldn't sleep at night. She kept thinking about whether Su Buling was angry and annoyed with her. She wanted to come over to apologize, but she felt that she didn't do anything wrong. She was beaten and kissed Su Buling, so no matter how big the mistake was, she should have made up for it. If I had known, I wouldn't have asked for the hairpin back. I don't know when this thought flashed through Song Yafu's mind, but she immediately suppressed it. The hairpin was left to her by her mother, and it can only be given to the person who will spend her life with her. If she gave it to Su Buling, wouldn't it be? Thinking of this, Song Yufu's face turned slightly red, and she hurriedly dismissed these messy thoughts. She will go to Yuelu Mountain with Uncle Su in a few days. Once they leave, they will be separated from each other. It is a question whether they can see each other again in this life. Although she has nothing to do with Su Buling, she still feels a little reluctant, so she wants to ask Uncle Su to help her take a painting away. Even if they are just friends, they need something to remember in the future. But painting requires seeing people. Song Yufu waited for many days in the Imperial College but didn't see Su Buling coming. She felt more and more disappointed. After struggling for a long time, she still ran over and prepared to ask Su Buling to go to Uncle Su. Of course, she didn't dare to tell him about painting. Well, just say that she will take him to see the painting saint, he should be interested. Thinking about it, it is inevitable that she is a little distracted. Song Yufu lowered her head and kicked the base of the stone lion with the tip of her shoe. Suddenly, she felt something warm beside her ear, as if something was very close. She instinctively turned her head, but she didn't expect that her lips would rub against the man's cheek. Ah! Song Yufu was so scared that she hurriedly stepped back, with a bit of shame in her eyes, but she was stunned when she looked up. I saw that the eldest son Su, who was dressed in white, was even more annoyed than her. He stood up and stepped back a few steps, covering his cheek with his hands, frowning his cold eyebrows, and said coldly, "Miss Song, are you addicted to kissing?" Song Yufu covered her lips and stared at Su Buling for a long time. Her chest rose and fell several times. Finally, she couldn't help it and said with a stern face, "Su Shizi, why are you the first to complain? It's obviously you. You dare to call me a villain." Su Buling's face was slightly cold, and he raised his hand to slap him a few times. Song Yufu hurriedly pushed away a few steps and leaned against the stone lion. Her delicate eyes were full of shame and she felt a little regretful. Wen Jing's temperament doesn't get angry, and she can't talk about the coming and going, so she can only say seriously, "Don't touch anything that's inappropriate. Prince Su has a body of 1,000 pieces of gold. Yeah, I'm wrong, why can't you be unreasonable?" Su Buling's eyes were dull. He supported the stone lion with his hands and pushed it against the wall. He lowered his head and looked at Song Yufu, who closed her eyes and tilted her head. "It's not me who has the final say. What's the truth? Tell me, how should you repay me for kissing me?" Song Yufu was a little angry, so she tried to get out from under Su Buling's arm, but was blocked tightly and had no way to escape. "I could only reluctantly extend my palm. I'll give you a couple of hits, thug." Su Buling nodded, raised his hand and prepared to hit him twice. Song Yufu shrank her neck, hurriedly closed her eyes and tilted her head, looking scared. After just waiting for a while, there was no pain on the palm. Instead, it sank slightly, and something cold was placed on the palm of the hand. Song Yufu was stunned for a moment, opened her eyes and took a look, only to see a rouge box lying in the palm of her hand. Xian Zizai's signature style was extremely beautiful in workmanship, while Su Buling had already turned around and walked towards the street. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 178. Hey Prince Su. Song Yufu held the rouge box, stunned for a moment before reacting, hurriedly trotting to Su Buling, stretched out her hand anxiously. "What are you doing, I?" Su Buling frowned slightly. "Don't like it?" I like it." Song Yufu blushed slightly, hesitated for a moment, folded her hands on her waist again, looked down at the small rouge box, but, "No merit, no reward, I am a girl, how can I accept rouge from a man, if I am misunderstood?" Su Buling walked slowly along the street, his expression as cold as ever. "What misunderstanding?" Misunderstanding, I want you to become a princess. Song Yufa pursed her lips, hesitated for a long time, and muttered, the prince is a vassal king, and the selection of a princess is the top priority. I was born in a poor family. Even if the prince wants me to be one, Prince Su will not agree. Of course, I'm just talking, I don't really want to be a princess. The prince and I are close friends, I will accept the rouge, thank you. Su Buling nodded, you are sensible, and I will let bygones be bygones. Tell me, what did you come to see me for? Song Yufa followed slowly, holding the rouge box. She wanted to say that she would leave in a few days, but for some reason, she couldn't say it. After thinking for a while, she smiled softly. Prince Su, my uncle Su Danking is back. He is the painting saint who painted the 8 great masters of Suan He. Do you want to meet him? I can introduce him to you. The painting saint Su Danking is very famous both in the martial arts world and among literati. He has been elusive for many years. For talented people in the world, whether civil or military, it is naturally a great honor to meet such a famous senior master. Song Yufa thought Su Buling would show a surprised look and let her take him over, but she didn't expect Su Buling to not even raise his eyebrows. He is just a painter. I don't have so much free time. Ah! Song Yufa suddenly had a headache. If Su Buling was not interested in Su Danking and didn't come to visit, she couldn't call Su Danking to the palace to ask for an audience. Su Danking is her uncle after all, and he is also a painting saint, so she should give him some face. Song Yufa thought for a while, Master Su, Princess Su is also one of the 8 great masters of Suan He. She met Uncle Su once. Uncle Su is also an elder, and he has heard of the master. Well, the master and I are friends, and it is natural for us to go to pay respect to the elders together. Su Buling was a little helpless, looking at the spring scenery in the city. Miss Song, it's such a good weather, why don't you ask me to go shopping and take me to visit relatives? Is it interesting? Interesting. Song Yufa nodded quickly, my uncle is amazing, and he is a very nice person. It's not too late for us to have a cup of tea and then go shopping. I will accompany the master for a day. Su Buling sighed, it's up to you. He changed the route to Zuji Street. Song Yufa's eyes lit up, and she followed behind excitedly, secretly looking at him. Sir, do you want to go back and change clothes? Su Buling frowned slightly, looked down at the snow-white robe on his body. Why, it doesn't look good. No, it looks good. Song Yufa pondered, well, the white robe with gold embroidery is better, the one with clouds on it. Su Buling's robes were all sewn by Madame Lu herself, and it was impossible to throw them away after wearing them. However, the best-looking one was stained with a lot of ink in the palace, and it would definitely not be washed clean for a while. She shook her head, just like that, it's not like I'm going on a blind date. Oh, that's fine. In the majestic imperial city, the spring breeze swept across the pavilions and towers, and the paper flowers in the peach forest of Lijhan Hall had long since withered and replaced with green buds full of vitality. In the garden of Changal Palace, hundreds of flower pots full of chrysanthemums have sprouted tiny dots of green. Several palace maids walked through them, watering and fertilizing them carefully, waiting for the day when all the flowers will bloom in autumn. Shortly after the morning bell rang, the Queen Mother opened the copper-locked door of the side hall. The morning light cast a delicate and graceful shadow on the floor of the bright hall. At the end of the shadow was a huge peony painting. The ink had dried, and it was more three-dimensional than a few days ago. The Queen Mother closed the door and walked alone to the huge peony. The table was placed in the middle of the hall, with rice paper and paint brushes on it, as well as a wooden sculpture of a little man. It was the appearance of Su Buling when he first entered the palace. It was so lifelike that even the pattern on his clothes was exactly the same. The Queen Mother stood in front of the painting table, looked at the peony, and then picked up the wooden man she carved by hand and looked at it carefully. There were some scratches on the wooden man. On the day it was just carved, before she had time to look at it carefully, Su Buling broke into her bedroom in the middle of the night and got into her bed. He touched her and snatched her belly band, basically doing all the bad things. The Queen Mother originally admired and loved Su Buling, but since then, her image in her mind has collapsed. She can't find a second adjective other than audacious and perverted. She just thinks that carving this sculpture is crazy, so she threw the wooden man into the garden. The result. In fact, it was later discovered that Su Buling was not very bad, but he was forced by the knife on his head. He became famous at a young age, had supernatural martial arts and a lot of talent, but was locked in a cage and waited for death. No matter how good his character is, he would probably go crazy. Su Buling's performance is actually very good, but he had no choice, and it can't be blamed entirely on him. Later, Su Buling repeatedly came to apologize. Although the belly band was not returned, the Empress Dowager Qinji saw it. She gave her snacks and rouge, praised her eloquently, and gave her the painting that was intended for Lu Hongluan. The two had no relationship, so what else could she do except to apologize to her? The Empress Dowager slightly curled her lips, raised her finger and flicked the forehead of the statue, revealing a little smile. In fact, after seeing this peony, she was no longer very angry. She just thought that she was touched by a child a few times. She couldn't ask for an account, so what else could she do except let bygones be bygones? The Empress Dowager put down the wooden man, added water and ink, picked up the paintbrush, and began to copy the scroll on the wall again. The painting techniques were different, and it was obviously impossible to copy it. It was just to find something to do during the boring days in the deep palace. Tap tap tap. After a while, footsteps were heard outside the side hall, and Xiao Yi said softly through the door. Empress Dowager, at the court meeting just now, the envoys of Northern Qi said that they wanted to compete with the younger generation of Dayu in martial arts. The emperor agreed. In a few days, a competition will be held outside the Taiji Palace. You are the mother of a country, so I'm afraid you have to go there to show your support. Because there is no queen, the Queen Dowager has to show up at large gatherings like this. The Queen Dowager was painting absent-mindedly and said casually, I know. Also, Madame Lu is here, and the carriage is waiting outside the palace. She asked you to leave the palace, but she didn't say what she was doing. What is Lu Hongluan doing here? The Queen Dowager paused, frowned slightly, and looked up at the peony flowers on the wall, guessing that she might be here to make trouble. However, the Queen Dowager has lived in the Deep Palace for a long time and has a detached status. She can't even find someone to quarrel with. It's also a matter for others to come to her. Whether it's good or bad, it's better than staying in the palace to mold. The Queen Mother thought for a while, then put down her brush, went back to her bedroom, dressed up beautifully, and then pretended to fight to the end, and rushed out of the palace with Xiao Yi. I wish all the students who are taking the college entrance examination today will be successful. Go for it. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 179. The Queen Mother walked through the corridors and left the sparsely populated Changle Palace. The Queen Mother leaned on the chariot, supporting her chin with her hand, showing a bit of laziness. From a distance, she saw Mrs. Lu standing at the palace gate. To the Queen Mother's surprise, she thought that Mrs. Lu would look sour and angry when she saw her, but she didn't expect that Mrs. Lu had also dressed up carefully today. Wearing a light blue water-cloud dress, with a gauze shawl draped over her arms, and her hands folded on her waist, Her slim figure actually has the freshness of a girl who has not yet left the pavilion. Her makeup was neither too heavy nor too light, her red lips were eye-catching, white jade pendants hung in her ears, and her hair was tied in a bun with hanging clouds. Even the hairpin that the Lu family hired from a famous Jiangnan master to customize when they got married was put on. The workmanship and cost of the golden laid jade flower-tailed hairpin is no worse than that of the Queen Mother's phoenix crown. It is regarded as a betrothal gift for the marriage of Xiao and Lu. It is the only one in the world. In the past, the Queen Mother even wanted to take a look at it. It is regarded as the lifeblood of Mrs. Lu. Even if I take a look at it, I'm afraid it will be damaged. This is the first time I have worn it in so many years. There were still several disciples of the Xiao family standing outside the palace. It seemed they were worried that the hairpin would be snatched away by a bold thief. The carriage stopped inside the palace gate. The Queen Mother was a little confused. Looking at Mrs. Lu, who was standing upright, even breathing as evenly as possible, she said jokingly, "Hongluan, you are dressed so grandly, are you planning to remarry? I can't make the decision in this matter. I have to go to Mr. Xiao and Mr. Lu." Spit dash. Mrs. Lu got angry when she heard these inappropriate words, but today she had something important to do and she couldn't get angry and ruin her makeup, so her expression didn't change and she said calmly, "If I have anything to do, please come to see the Queen Mother. Please also ask the Queen Mother to accompany me out of the palace." "Where are you going?" "I am busy with all kinds of official duties, and I have no interest in going out for a walk with you." The Queen Mother was leaning on the carved chariot with no intention of getting up. At this time, she walked in and took a closer look, only to find that Mrs. Lu was really a bit more gorgeous today. Not only was her temperament and makeup impeccable, but even the skirt on her body was not flawless. Flaw. Yunu was still watching carefully, fearing that the dress she had finally put together would have any wrinkles and would have to be reworked. Mrs. Lu tried her best to control her emotions, and did not mention the anger she had suffered in the past few days. She walked up to him and said softly, "Su Danking returned to Chang'an. I inquired for a few days and found out that he lived in Song Jiju's house. You know Su Danking and asked him to paint a picture for me." Puff. Before she finished speaking, the Queen Mother laughed so hard that she covered her lips with her red sleeves and looked up and down with a hint of teasing. "Hongluan, Hongluan, you are already married, you are about the same age as me, and you still want to be with me when you are young. Are you ashamed to fight for the 8 beauties of Zhaohong?" Mrs. Lu's mature cheeks were a little red, and she pursed her lips in annoyance, but she couldn't open her mouth to refute. Naturally, she wouldn't want to compete with a 14-year-old or 15-year-old girl for fame, and she wouldn't have any use for it. But a few days ago, the Queen Mother gave Su Danking's paintings to Su Buling. Su Buling obviously liked them very much and hid them under the bed. She has nothing to give, and she has not said this yet. Su Danking finally showed up. How could he let go of this God-given opportunity? Mrs. Lu hesitated for a moment and hummed, "When I met Su Danking, I was too young to paint. Anyway, I want a painting. It doesn't matter whether I have a reputation or not. The Queen Mother will take me there." The Queen Mother held her chin with her hand and raised her eyebrows. "Why should I agree to you? Huh? This is deliberately stirring up trouble." Mrs. Lu glared at the Queen Mother for a few times, thought for a while, and said coldly, "The Queen Mother stays in the palace all day, aren't you afraid of getting sick? I'll go out with you to relax, what's the matter?" The Queen Mother sneered, knowing that what Mrs. Lu was thinking about was Xian and Ba Kui's affairs. She looked like it was none of her business and turned her head to look at the clouds in the sky. Mrs. Lu took a breath, thought carefully, and took a rare step back. "The Queen Mother will accompany me, and I will return the painting to the Queen Mother. I don't have the shame to take back the things you sent out." The Queen Mother didn't care, and thought for a moment, "How about this? In the future, Su Buling?" "No. Before she finished speaking, Mrs. Lu became serious and had a straight face. The last time Su Buling came to the palace, he tricked her and gave her things, and he even left the peonies for her in the palace. She was so angry that she woke up from sleep these days. She was being polite when she didn't come to quarrel with the Queen Mother. How can we allow Su Buling to enter the palace again? What if after some time, she really changes her tune and calls the Queen Mother her aunt? Mrs. Lu looked like there was no need for discussion, and snorted lightly, "The palace is such an important place, how can men often enter it? The Queen Mother should pay attention to her status." The Queen Mother was not surprised by Mrs. Lu's reaction, and she acted like she had not discussed it with you. Tinger and Linger are all juniors of this palace. Why not let them come and visit me from time to time? I and Linger, you said it because of our old friendship. If you don't agree, he will still come if I ask him to come. Mrs. Lu narrowed her eyes slightly. If I don't let your son come over, he will definitely not come over. He listens to me the most. The Queen Mother sighed, Hongluan, it's not me who is telling you. Your Majesty must obey your advice. If you are so ignorant, even the most obedient people will be disgusted with you sooner or later. When the time comes, tisk tisk tisk, he will call you aunt, you are her aunt. If he doesn't scream, you have nothing to do with it, alas. These words touched Mrs. Lu's heart. This was what she was most worried about. She pursed her lips and wanted to retort, how could you bother me, but after thinking about it for a while, she endured it and just said calmly. Your child has his own opinion. He wants to enter the palace and be filial to the Queen Mother. I will not interfere, hurry up. The Queen Mother raised her thin eyebrows, then stood up contentedly, walked gracefully to the outside of the palace gate, and stretched out her arms. Mrs. Lu looked disgusted, but she had to bow her head to ask for help. After thinking for a while, she held the Queen Mother's arm and walked towards the carriage without sincerity. If Su Danking doesn't paint, the Queen Mother will threaten him. If he dares not agree, The Queen Mother looked embarrassed. How can this be done? He is a famous talent. If I force him to paint, what will happen if it gets out? Mrs. Lu narrowed her eyes slightly, with a bit of sarcasm. This is not the first time you have done this. When Su Danking went to paint Miss Yao Er, you persuaded him to change it to paint you. The Queen Mother paused and turned to walk back. Hey, Mrs. Lu was angry and gritted her teeth. She had to stop talking and pointed at the carriage. Queen Mother, please. That's better. The Queen Mother nodded with satisfaction and was helped into the carriage. The two of them, accompanied by a group of palace maids, headed towards Suji Street. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 180. Tanghulu. Buy coal, forget it, I'm leaving. Vendors are noisy, mist rises in the market, merchants coming and going from north to south are crowded together, and the small streets are filled with a dazzling array of objects, including porcelain from the south of the Yangtze River, animal skins from Mobei, seafood from Nanyu, and even it is a jade medicinal material from the western regions thousands of miles away. Song Yufu followed Su Buring in small steps, seemingly unaware of the familiar scenery on the street, and only secretly glanced at the tall back of the man in front of her. Su Buling walked and looked, like a tourist, stopping in front of individual stalls from time to time to look at a few familiar and unfamiliar objects. Ever since he found a way to detoxify, Su Buling found that his mood had changed a lot. Well, maybe he had begun to integrate into this society. He took it as he came. There was no feasting and neon lights all over the street. The streets were full of antique charm. The same it can make people feel a different kind of scenery. Su Buletinling was tall and naturally had to walk faster because of his long legs. Song Yufuzi followed him gracefully for a few streets. In fact, his legs were a little sore, but it was hard for Su Buletinling to stop and rest. She thought about it. Thinking about it, he ran a few steps away and walked side by side, and said, Su Shize, what are you looking at? Su Buring chuckled lightly, shook his head and said nothing. Song Yufu pursed her lips, hesitated for a while, and said softly, Does Prince Su know about Yuelu Mountain? I know a little bit. Mr. Song seems to have come from somewhere, right? I heard that there was a very powerful master who taught 4 apprentices, all of whom were outstanding. Mr. Storyteller often mentioned this. He, that's my grandpa. Back then, my father wanted to go to Beijing to take the imperial examination and pursue an official career, but he came down early and kidnapped my mother. Su Buling raised his eyebrows and thought for a moment, you should have grown up in Chang'an. Have you never met your grandfather? Yes. Song Yufu nodded, with a little yearning in her eyes, I have wanted to go there since I was a child, but I just haven't had the chance. Does Prince Su want to go to Yuelu Mountain? Ordinary people in the world can't see my grandpa, but if I'm here, you should be able to see. Su Buring smiled softly, Yuelu Mountain is under the jurisdiction of the king of Chu. The Chu people are good at swords. They are known as 1,000,000 swordsmen, and the Chu people have 80% of them. It is a place with a strong martial arts atmosphere. If there is a chance, of course, I'm going to take a look. Song Yufu's eyes lit up, and she nodded lightly, as the saying goes, only Chu has talent. The literati and martial arts people there are all very powerful. Prince Su is a dragon and a phoenix among people. If he doesn't go through it, he will be too good. It's a pity, my grandpa is very powerful. Su Buling turned his head and raised his eyebrows, what? You want to take me to meet my parents? Song Yufu didn't quite understand, but she probably understood the meaning, that's it? Okay, after I leave Chang'an safe and sound, I will go back to Suzhou first, and then see if I have the chance to travel around the world. Song Yufu pursed her lips and smiled, and comforted her seriously, don't worry, Your Majesty, you must be fine. When Su Buling heard these words, he always felt a chill on his back and his face darkened slightly. You'd better stop talking. Just reassure me that something will happen. Ah, Song Yufu felt a little aggrieved, rolled her eyes, and then changed her words. Don't worry, Prince, something will happen to you. Su Buling rubbed his fingers and thought about it for a while, then nodded slightly. His words didn't sound very pleasant, but he felt much more at ease in his heart. The two walked slowly on the street, passed through several markets, and came to Zuji Street. Most of the people living here are students rushing to take exams from all over the world. Because it is spring, there are basically no pedestrians on the street. Under the willow trees, in the stone pavilions, and in the tea houses, there are overcrowded people. There are people everywhere holding poems and books. He is also a scholar and scholar. Arriving at the entrance of the alley, Song Yufu quickly walked a few steps and ran to the front to lead the way. She wanted to say hello to Su Danking in advance, but when she looked up, she saw a large group of guards standing outside the small courtyard deep in the alley, waiting for the palace maid. He and several maids from rich families all looked full of admiration. They stood on tiptoes and leaned on the low courtyard wall to secretly look at him. Song Yufu was stunned, and after careful identification, she recognized Mrs. Lu's maid Yunu. She stopped hurriedly, a little panicked. Could it be that Mrs. Lu knew about the arrival of Prince Su and me and came to the door in advance? Thinking of this, Song Yufu's face turned red, she lowered her head and ran out of the alley, and whispered. Su Shize, please don't say that you came here with me. If Mrs. Lu misunderstands, you will be in trouble. I'm going back to the Imperial College. Su Buling was also a little surprised as to why Mrs. Lu was here. He followed Song Yufu and was discovered by Mrs. Lu. He inevitably had to think about it for several days. He should have turned around and left with Song Yufu, but there were still people standing outside the yard. Chiao Yi, I'm afraid the Queen Mother is also a guest in the courtyard. Thinking of this, Su Buling did not chase Miss Song, who fled, but walked to the courtyard wall to see the situation. When the Queen Mother travels, she must be heavily guarded. The bodyguards and palace maids directly surround the small courtyard, making it impossible to pass by quietly. Su Buling raised his hand to signal Yunu and Xiao Yi to keep quiet. Then he walked to the courtyard wall and took a sneak peek. I expected to see a scene of people sitting in front of the tea table chatting and laughing, but the scene in the yard made Su Buling's eyes full of astonishment. In the small courtyard, a middle-aged man wearing a blue Confucian shirt was standing in the corner of the courtyard holding a jet black oil paper umbrella. His face was full of embarrassment, and he kept raising his hands to bow. Under the eaves, the Queen Mother was sitting lazily on a chair, and Mrs. Lu stood upright beside her. Several dead soldiers of the Xiao family were holding swords and looking fierce. Su Danking, you have to paint today, even if you don't paint, otherwise I will let out the news that you are here. Do you believe it or not, the wives of the princes and princes, and several officials? Princess, can you never leave Chang'an in your life? The Empress Dowager's voice is ethereal and moving, her tone is calm, but she is born with a bit of the pressure of a superior. Mrs. Lu was as gentle and generous as ever. She stood next to the Queen Mother and comforted her softly, "Don't be angry, Queen Mother. Su Danking is a talented man who has been famous for many years. It is not easy to come to Chang'an." Yes, the two sisters worked together to bully the weak scholar. Two charming maids, Yu Inu and Xiao Yi, stood beside Su Buling's left and right hands and looked around together. Yunu wanted to be more gentle and secretly approached Su Buling's ear and said softly, "Little prince, don't go in. If you do, the lady will definitely not be able to get off the stage, so she will turn around and run away." Xiao Yi was obviously a little bold. When she saw Yunu coming so close, she followed suit and chuckled, "Yes, Mrs. Lu made a special trip to the palace today to invite the Queen Mother to come over. If she was disturbed by the young prince, she would definitely come back again. I want to be angry with the young prince." Su Buling naturally had no intention of going in. He just stood with his hands behind his back and looked cold, watching Su Danking's joke.